The night my father sold me to a Mafia boss. I expected him to ruin me. But instead, he killed the man who tried. The night my father sold me to Vane Solari, I expected the world to turn red. I expected the cold iron of a cage, the cruel touch of a man who viewed women as currency, and the slow erasure of my soul. Vane was the architect of Ash, a man whose reputation was built on the bones of those who crossed him. My father handed him my contract with trembling hands, eyes averted from the daughter he had just traded to settle a gambling debt. I waited for the ruin. I waited for Vane to claim what he had paid for. But as we stood in the flickering candlelight of his private chapel, the air didn't turn red. It turned ice cold. When the man who had brokered the deal tried to place a proprietary hand on my shoulder, Vane didn't just intervene. He drew a silenced pistol and ended the man's life before the first wedding vow was even finished. "Don't touch what isn't yours," Vane whispered, not to me but to the corpse on the floor. That's when I realized I wasn't the prisoner. I was the prize he was willing to burn the city to protect. He looked at me then, his eyes like polished obsidian, and for the first time in my life, I felt a different kind of fear. Not the fear of being ruined, but the fear of being loved by a monster.
Before we continue, we welcome you to AFRO-KOREAN love thrillers, the home of dark romance, forbidden passion, power, betrayal, and captivating revenge stories. Please do me a favor. Tap that comment section and tell us quickly where you are watching from. Stay tuned. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any new thriller that drops here. Sit back and relax because this story is just getting started. Now let's get back to our story.
The chapel of the Solari estate didn't smell of incense. It smelled of gunpowder and old secrets. I stood at the altar, my breath hitching in the throat of my lace bodice, watching the man I was supposed to call husband. Vane Solari didn't look like a groom. He looked like a reaper who had just finished a harvest. The broker, a man named Harkin who had spent weeks tallying my worth like livestock, lay crumpled at the base of a marble saint. His blood was a dark, spreading ink on the pristine white isle. Vane hadn't even broken his stride to pull the trigger. He had simply eliminated the man who dared to touch the lace of my sleeve with a proprietary smirk. "The union is sealed," the priest stammered, his eyes darting to the cooling corpse. His voice trembled so violently, the prayer book nearly slipped from his hands. Vane turned to me. He didn't reach for my veil to reveal the face he had just purchased. He didn't offer a kiss to finalize the transaction. He simply adjusted the cuff of his charcoal jacket, his movements precise and terrifyingly calm. That's when I realized I wasn't the prisoner. I was the prize he was willing to burn the city to protect. "Take Miss Zephyra to the East Wing," Vane commanded his men, his voice a low, melodic baritone that never once rose in heat. "See that she has everything she requires. She is a guest of this house, not a prisoner." The guards, men built like brick walls and armed to the teeth, didn't shove me toward the exit. They bowed. They moved with a synchronized reverence that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Guest," the word felt like jagged glass in my mouth. I stepped over the broker's body, my heels clicking against the stone. "Vane, you bought me. My father signed the vellum in front of the families. According to the laws of your world, I am your wife." Vane paused, his hand on the heavy oak door that led back to the world of shadows he ruled. He looked back at me, his eyes like polished obsidian, devoid of the lust or cruelty I had been braced for. There was no heat in his gaze, only a cold, crystalline distance. "You are a Solari in name only, Miss Zephyra," he said, the title cutting sharper than any blade. "I have no intention of claiming a debt paid in blood. You will have your own rooms. You will have your own life." I should have run while the doors were still open and the confusion was high. I didn't. I watched him walk away, leaving me in the middle of a blood-stained chapel with a title that meant nothing and a safety that felt like a threat. That was the moment everything changed. I had been sold to a monster, but the monster was refusing to play his part. The East Wing was a gilded cage of silent marble and soft velvet, a place where the air felt too heavy to breathe. I stood on the balcony in a robe of liquid black silk, the morning mist clinging to my skin like a shroud. Below, in the courtyard of the Obsidian estate, The morning shift of the Solari guard moved with the lethality of a precision blade. As I leaned over the stone railing, my silhouette catching the light, the rhythmic thrum of their boots stopped instantly. Every single man, armored in matte black and carrying enough steel to level a city block, dropped to one knee. Their heads bowed in a synchronized wave of submission, not a single eye daring to lift toward the guest of the house. I pulled the silk tighter around my chest, a shiver racing down my spine. That's when I realized I wasn't the prisoner. I was the sovereign they were sworn to die for. I should have run. The gates were being checked, the perimeter was shifting, and I knew the back service routes better than any outsider. But my feet remained rooted to the stone. Turning back into the dim expanse of the master suite, I expected to find the predatory king of crows claiming the center of the room. Instead, I found Vane on the long leather sofa near the fireplace, still wearing his dress shirt from the night before, the top buttons undone. His long legs were stretched out, his chest rising and falling in the deep, heavy rhythm of a man who hadn't slept in days. He hadn't touched the massive, four-poster bed. He hadn't even crossed the threshold of the invisible line he had drawn between us at the altar. A man who bought a wife was supposed to claim her. A man who owned a soul was supposed to consume it. But Vane lay there in the gray dawn light, vulnerable yet untouchable, guarding the door from the inside. I stood in the center of the room, the silence of the mansion roaring in my ears. He bought me, but he wouldn't claim me. It was a mercy that felt like a mockery, a protection that made me feel more invisible than my father's gambling debts ever had. I walked toward him, my bare feet silent on the Persian rug. I reached out a hand, intending to wake him, to demand an explanation for this strange, respectful exile. But as my fingers ghosted near his shoulder, he shifted in his sleep, a low groan escaping his throat. I pulled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. That was the moment everything changed. I wasn't waiting for him to ruin me anymore. I was waiting for him to look at me. The following days were a blur of hushed luxury and unsettling reverence. I moved through the Solari estate like a ghost haunting its own palace, waiting for the illusion of safety to shatter. But the deeper I ventured into the heart of the obsidian fortress, the more the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I found myself at the entrance of the Grand Library, a monolithic space of glass walls and towering shelves that overlooked the jagged cliffs of the coast. As I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the soft rustle of activity inside died instantly. A dozen staff members in crisp gray uniforms were scattered throughout the room, some polishing the glass, others cataloging leather-bound tomes. They didn't just stop, they recoiled in a wave of profound respect. Trays were lowered, heads were bowed, and the silence became a living, breathing thing. A young woman near the window dropped her cleaning cloth, her eyes darting to the floor in a panic as if looking at me were a sin punishable by death. "Please," I whispered, the word echoing off the glass. "You don't have to do that." None of them moved. None of them spoke. To them, I wasn't just Vane's guest. I was a living deity in a silk shroud. I walked past a line of servers and they stepped back in unison, clearing a path as if I carried a plague of divinity. I reached for a book on a lower shelf, and before my fingers could even brush the spine, an older man was there, his white-gloved hands trembling as he offered to carry it for me. That's when I realized I wasn't the prisoner. I was the sun around which this entire dark universe orbited. I should have been relieved, but the weight of their submission felt like a brand. In my father's house, I had been an ornament, a bargaining chip to be bartered away. Here, I was a queen without a crown. Granted a power I hadn't earned and didn't understand. Vane had given me the keys to his kingdom, but he had stayed in the shadows, refusing to tell me why. As I stood by the glass wall, watching the gray waves crash against the rocks below, I caught my reflection. I didn't look like the broken girl who had stood at the altar. I looked like a woman who could command an army with a glance. I should have run. I should have used this strange freedom to find a way out of the Solari grip. But the mystery of the architect was a pull stronger than fear. That was the moment everything changed. I stopped looking for the exits and started looking for the man who had built this sanctuary of ash. The stone walls of the estate were cold, but the truth was a frost that settled deep into my marrow. I had been wandering the West Corridor, a place of heavy shadows and velvet drapes, when the low, serrated edge of an argument drifted through the cracks of a study door. I pressed my back against the masonry, my breath hitching as I recognized the baritone resonance of Vane's voice, stripped of its usual composure. "You overstepped, Vane," a raspy, ancient voice hissed, one of the council elders, the men who traded in human misery long before Vane took the throne. "The girl's father offered her to the Xylos syndicate first. Their bid was triple what we paid. You interfered with a high-level trade for a girl you won't even touch." I froze, the air in the hallway turning to jagged shards of ice. I waited for Vane to defend my honor, to speak of the marriage or the debt. But the silence that followed was longer, heavier. "Harkin didn't buy a bride," Vane's voice returned, dropping to a lethal, quiet register. "He bought a harvest. Her father didn't just sign her away for gambling debts, Elder. He signed her over to a clinic in the black market districts. He sold her for her blood, her marrow, her very life. She was a shipment of parts to him, nothing more." A wave of nausea crashed over me, so violent I had to clutch the cold stone to keep from collapsing. I should have run. I should have fled into the night until my lungs burned. But I couldn't move. My own father, the man who had tucked me into bed and walked me through the rose gardens, hadn't just sold me to a monster. He had sold me to a slaughterhouse. "And so you bought her to play hero," the elder mocked, a dry, rattling sound. "You spent millions to pull a lamb from the blade just to keep her as a guest." "I bought her to burn the market to the ground," Vane snarled, the sound of a chair scraping back echoing through the door. "And if any of you ever suggest her value is anything less than the life she carries, I will ensure yours is appraised in the same clinic." That was the moment everything changed. The villain wasn't the mafia boss who slept on the couch and treated me like a goddess. It was the man who shared my DNA. Vane hadn't bought a prisoner. He had purchased my life back from the grave. I slid down the wall, my silk dress pooling around me in the dark. The architect of Ash was a man of fire, and for the first time, I realized he wasn't keeping me at a distance out of coldness. He was keeping me at a distance because he knew that if I got too close to the flame, I might see just how much of the world he was willing to burn for me. I didn't go back to my room. I didn't hide in the shadows of the East Wing. Instead, I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the study, the wood groaning as if to warn me that once I crossed this threshold, there was no returning to the girl I used to be. Vane was standing by the fireplace, the charcoal of his suit blending into the dimness of the room. In his hand, he held a sleek obsidian tablet, the digital ledger that contained the record of my sale, the price of my life, and the names of the men who had planned to carve me into pieces. He didn't turn when I entered. He simply stared into the flames, the flickering orange light dancing in his dark, hollow eyes. "You shouldn't have been in the hallway, Zephyra," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "You bought me to slaughter them," I whispered, stepping into the warmth of the hearth. "The elder said you interfered with a high-level trade. You didn't just pay a debt, you declared war." Vane finally turned, his gaze heavy with a weariness that made him look human for the first time. "They saw a shipment," he said, his voice dropping to a rasp. "They saw a collection of assets. I saw a girl who had been betrayed by the one person who was supposed to be her shield." He held up the tablet. With a single, decisive swipe of his thumb, he wiped the drive, then tossed the device into the heart of the fire. The plastic bubbled and the screen hissed, the digital record of my ownership turning into toxic smoke. "I didn't buy a wife, Zephyra. I bought the time I need to kill every man who put a price on your head." That was the moment everything changed. I should have been terrified of the violence he was promising, but as the ledger melted into ash, I felt a weight lift that I had carried since birth. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't a prisoner. I was the reason the architect of Ash was going to burn the world. "I didn't think I was worth that much," I murmured, moving closer until the heat of the fire, and the heat of him clouded my senses. Vane reached out, his fingers stopping just an inch from my cheek, still refusing to cross the distance he had established. "You are the only thing in this city that isn't for sale," he whispered, "and I will make sure they learn that before I'm through." I looked into his eyes, and I didn't see a mafia boss. I saw a guardian who was drowning in his own darkness just to keep me in the light. I should have run. I should have feared the blood that was about to be spilled. But as the embers died down, I realized I didn't want to leave the sanctuary he had built out of ash. The rain began as a soft weeping, turning the obsidian stones of the central courtyard into a mirror for the storm. I didn't seek cover. The cold needles of water soaked through my silk gown, grounding me as I waited for him. When the heavy glass doors finally groaned open, Vane didn't approach with his usual calculated grace. He moved with a heavy, restless energy, his charcoal coat already over his arm. He reached me in seconds, snapping the heavy wool open and draping it over my trembling shoulders. The scent of him, sandalwood, rain, and expensive tobacco, wrapped around me, warmer than any fire. He didn't pull away this time. His hands lingered on the lapels of the coat, his knuckles brushing the hollow of my throat. "You'll catch your death, Zephyra," he murmured, his eyes searching mine in the raw, flickering light of the garden lanterns. "Why did you marry me, Vane?" The question cut through the rhythm of the downpour, sharp and unavoidable. "You don't want the debt. You won't take the title of husband. You sleep on a sofa like a stranger in your own home. If you just wanted to save me, you could have sent me away. Why tie yourself to me?" Vane's grip tightened on the coat, pulling me a fraction closer until I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. His jaw set, a muscle leaping in his cheek as the silence stretched between us, filled only by the roar of the rain. That was the moment everything changed. I should have been looking for an escape, but I was searching for a reason to stay. "Because no one else deserved to own you," he rasped, the words torn from a place of deep, jagged honesty. "And in this city, if you don't belong to a Solari, you are prey. I took the name, the contract, and the burden of your life so that the world would have to go through me to get to you." He leaned down, his forehead almost touching mine, his breath ghosting over my lips. "I don't touch you because I don't want to be another man who takes what he wants from you. I wanted to give you the one thing you've never had." "What?" I whispered, my heart sinking with his in a frantic, beautiful rhythm. "A choice," he said, his voice breaking. "I bought your freedom, Zephyra, even if that means you eventually choose to leave me." I looked up into the dark, tormented depths of his eyes, and the emotional hook sank deep into my soul. He wasn't the monster who had purchased my body. He was the man who had sacrificed his peace to protect my spirit. I realized then that I wasn't the prisoner of a Mafia king. I was the soulmate of a man who would rather starve than consume me without my consent. The wind on the rooftop helipad was a howling beast, whipping my hair into a dark frenzy and stinging my eyes with the salt of the sea. Below us, the city was a sprawling carpet of electric veins, amber, white, and predatory red. Vane stood directly behind me, his presence a solid, unyielding wall of warmth against the midnight chill. For the first time, he didn't maintain the polite distance of a guardian. His chest brushed my shoulder, and his hands came up to cover mine as I gripped the cold steel of the perimeter railing. "Look past the lights, Zephyra," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear, vibrating through the silk of his coat which still draped over me. "The world sees a metropolis. A sovereign sees a circulatory system." He guided my hand, pointing toward the darkened industrial docks to the south and the glittering skyscrapers of the financial district to the north. "Power isn't about who has the most guns. It's about who controls the flow. If you sever the artery at the port, the heart in the high-rises stops beating within 48 hours. That is how you win a war before the first shot is fired." That's when I realized I wasn't the prisoner learning to live in a cage. I was a student learning to dismantle the world that had tried to sell me. Vane was breaking the cardinal rule of the Solari. The code of detachment that dictated a wife was a shadow, a silent witness to a man's legacy. By showing me the maps of his mind, he was making me a co-conspirator. He was handing me the blade. "Why are you teaching me this?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the rhythmic thrum of a distant helicopter. "You said I had a choice. You said I could leave." "I did," Vane said, his grip on my hands tightening just enough to feel the pulse in his palms. "But if you choose to stay, I won't have you sitting on the sidelines while I burn the world for you. If you are to be a Solari, you will be the one holding the torch." He turned me then, his hands sliding from my fingers to my waist, anchoring me. The raw, intimate lighting of the helipad cast his face in sharp angles of shadow and silver. I should have been terrified by the cold logic of his violence, the way he viewed the city as a series of weaknesses to be exploited. I should have run from the darkness he was inviting me into. I didn't. That was the moment everything changed. I realized that the architect of Ash didn't want a trophy to protect. He wanted a queen to rule beside him. And as I looked into his obsidian eyes, I realized I was finally ready to stop being the prey. The serenity of the Solari estate was a fragile glass dome, and it shattered with the scream of tearing metal. I was in the library, tracing the spine of the book Vane had gifted me, when the first perimeter alarm wailed, a harsh, discordant cry that signaled the death of my peace. That was the moment everything changed. I didn't need to be told who had done it. I could feel the ghost of my father's greed in the air, a final, desperate betrayal. He hadn't just sold my location. He had sold the coordinates of the only sanctuary I had ever known to the Xylos cartel. "Zephyra, get down!" Vane's voice thundered from the hallway, a sound of pure, unadulterated command. I hit the floor just as the glass walls of the library disintegrated into a million diamond shards. The night air, once still and cold, was suddenly alive with the rhythmic, terrifying pulse of automatic fire. High-speed motion blurred the gardens outside as shadowy figures in tactical gear breached the obsidian walls. Muzzle flashes rhythmically illuminated the dark greenery, strobing like a nightmare, each burst of light revealing a soldier inching closer to the heart of the house. I should have run to the panic room. I should have hidden in the dark. But my pulse was a frantic drum, and for the first time I felt the cold, hard logic Vane had taught me on the rooftop. I wasn't the prey anymore. Vane burst through the doors, his charcoal suit jacket gone, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the tensed muscles of a man born for war. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with a lethal focus. He slid a sleek silver revolver across the polished floor toward me. "They are coming for the shipment, Zephyra," he rasped, his eyes flashing with a predatory light as a grenade detonated in the courtyard, shaking the foundations of the room. "Show them the architect doesn't keep cargo." "He keeps a queen." Air was a toxic haze of plastered dust and the metallic tang of spent shells. We were moving through the narrow service corridor toward the heart of the estate, the world outside a chaotic symphony of sirens and shattering glass. Vane was a shadow in motion, his body positioned perpetually between me and the open doorways, his movements a masterclass in lethal grace. He didn't look back. He simply reached behind him, his hand finding mine, his grip a crushing, desperate anchor. "Almost there," he rasped, his voice strained through the adrenaline. "The vault is at the end of this hall. Once the door seals, the Solari reinforcements will arrive. You just have to hold out for 10 minutes." We reached the heavy steel slab of the safe room vault, the mechanisms already hissing open as Vane punched in the override. But as the door groaned on its hinges, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from the darkness of the intersecting hallway. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of the soldiers outside. It was the precise, singular pop of a sniper who had found a gap in the armor. I felt the air shift before I heard the impact. Vane didn't hesitate. There was no calculation, no strategy, only a raw, primal instinct. With a strength that nearly knocked the wind out of me, he threw his entire weight against my chest, shoving me backward into the cold, reinforced interior of the vault. As I stumbled back, my eyes locked onto his, and I watched the world slow down into a series of jagged, silent frames. A crimson bloom erupted across the pristine white of his dress shirt, a violent contrast that looked like a rose petal unfolding in fast forward. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, the force of the impact spinning him toward the ground. I watched him fall, his knees buckling, his hand clawing at the vault door to pull it shut from the outside. That was the moment everything changed. The roar of the gunfight, the screaming alarms, the heavy thud of his body hitting the floor. It all vanished into a vacuum of absolute, terrifying silence. "Vane!" I screamed, but no sound left my throat. He looked at me through the narrowing gap of the steel door, his face pale, a thin trail of blood escaping the corner of his mouth. Even as the light began to fade from his obsidian eyes, he didn't look afraid. He looked relieved. He had spent his life building walls of ash to keep the world away, and in his final act, he had become the wall himself. "Now," he whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound as the lock engaged with a heavy, final click. "I finally touched you." The door sealed, leaving me in the total, freezing darkness of the vault. I stood there, my hands pressed against the vibrating steel, listening to the silence of a world where the only man who had ever truly seen me was bleeding out on the other side. The darkness of the vault was absolute, a heavy, airless tomb that smelled of cold iron and the ghost of Vane's sandalwood scent. I pressed my ear to the reinforced steel, the silence on the other side more terrifying than the gunfire had been. Minutes or hours could have passed before the mechanical groan of the override echoed through the chamber. The door hissed open, revealing a world painted in the violent, flickering hues of a dying fire. Vane lay where he had fallen, a fallen king on a battlefield of marble. The white of his shirt was gone, replaced by a deep, wet crimson that pooled around him like a velvet cloak. His chest was barely moving, his breath a shallow, rattling ghost of its former power. The Xylo's soldiers were gone, chased into the night by the arrival of the Solari reinforcements, but the shadows they left behind were darker than the men themselves. I stepped out of the vault, my ruined silk dress trailing through the blood-stained dust. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The grief was there, a cold weight in my chest, but it was being rapidly incinerated by a new, jagged clarity. That was the moment everything changed. I knelt beside him, my fingers steady as I reached for the silver revolver that had fallen from his hand. It was heavy, warm from his grip, and pulsed with the lingering energy of the man who had used it to shield me. "They think they won, Vane," I whispered, the words coming out as cold and hard as the steel in my palm.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets you know when new videos drop. Lastly, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video.